We'll invite up Rabbi Rich for
Yeah.
today's message.
Okay. Oh, I think I need that stool. I'll stay put for the sake of the camera. Hello, everyone in Zoom land. Nice to be with you all. Wow, what a day we're having. The Seder last night, magnificent today. I love the seating arrangement, have to admit. Okay, we'll talk about that more. But here's an interesting thing. Sometimes rabbis of old came up with ideas that are so amazingly consonant with our convictions about the identity of the Messiah, Yeshua. And the other day, Dave sent a podcast to me. I think he sent it to Dan, maybe some others. Maybe I think Rabbi Nathan got it too. And it was a podcast about telling stories at the Passover Seder. Very good, excellent. But along the way, one of the participants mentioned a rabbinic tradition which, frankly, I had not been aware of. I don't think any of us were aware of it at that point. And it had to do with the Karpas. Now, Karpas is the greens that we dip in salt water, and it's the first event of the Seder after you get past the preliminaries of candle lighting and a couple of other elements. So in a sense, it's the first major act of the Seder, if you will. And the tradition that was talked about was so interesting that I wanted to share it with you, and it had to do with the word Karpas. What does that word mean, Karpas? You know, and it turns out it's only used once in the entire Bible. It's used in the book of Esther, chapter 1, verse 6, which describes the magnificent palace of Ahasuerus, the king, because he was making a big banquet, and it talked about hangings, beautiful woolen hangings, which were just there to show his splendor and his riches and his glory. And the word used for these hangings is karpas. So the rabbinic tradition goes like this, that the karpas, being a cloth and occurring during the Passover Seder, that part of the ceremony, reminded the rabbis of something that happened which really initiated the whole Passover story, and that was Joseph's coat of many colors, a cloth of many colors that really, in a sense, was the initiating reality which began a whole series of steps eventuating in his being sold into slavery, being taken to Egypt, the brothers coming down, eventually their whole family moving to Goshen in Egypt, and the 400 years of slavery, and in the Exodus. Are you with me on that so far? You follow what I'm saying? Okay. So the rabbis, using that kind of rabbinic imagination, but not coming out of nowhere, it had some justification. And so that cloth became an initiating event, to speak in terms of what's called literary criticism, the initiating event, culminating all the way centuries later in the Exodus. But to the rabbis, they said, in the Middle Ages, commentators who said, you know, karpas dipped in salty water, that doesn't quite capture it. Really what should be used is red vinegar, symbolizing the blood of the animal. Get this now, the blood of the animal. You recall that Joseph's brothers wanted to fake out, wanted to deceive Dad, and so what they did is they took an animal, slaughtered it, and dipped the katuna pasim, the coat of many colors, and they dipped it and said, Dad, look, your son has been killed by a wild animal. And they said, in light of that event, culminating in what we talk about at Pesach, which is, of course, the redemption from Egypt. So it was a tradition. Now, it didn't take on, and there were excellent. What we do is dipping in salt water, and tonight at the Seder, you'll hear more about that, or last night, of course. Now, that is that tradition, cloth representing an initiating event. Well, I would like to share with you about another cloth that represents And I would like to talk with you about, if you can put up that, I'd like to talk with you about another cloth known in history as the Shroud of Turin. How many of you have heard of it before? You have heard of it before? Okay, good. Well, maybe you have some knowledge of it, but I want to tell you about it because it is really quite something, okay? So here, we don't have the whole shroud. We just have the face of the man. And just focus on that face for a moment. And notice its grandeur and its sadness. That face really speaks powerfully. And we'll talk about some of the markings in a few minutes. But what is the shroud? Again, this is just a portion. The shroud is 14 feet by 3 feet, and it is a burial shroud. It's made of linen. It was an expensive piece of cloth sewn in what's called a herringbone fashion, which was a common sewing method for nice things back in the first century. And it had been considered and has been considered the actual burial cloth of Yeshua, and it has been in various places. We have evidence for why, the claim that it started in Jerusalem, and then according to history it went to Edessa, a city in Turkey, then to Constantinople, then to a town called Lille in France, and ultimately moved to the other side of the Alps to Turin in Italy, where it has been privately owned by a family called the Savoy family. Been with them for centuries and centuries, but the custodians, of course, are the Roman Church, the Roman Catholic Church. Now, again, I want to suggest that we have a cloth which is an initiated reality. It began something, and we'll talk about what it is that it began. Now, the question, of course, is it authentic? I mean, that's a very legitimate question. Now, when we come to the more midrashic treatment about the Karpas, it isn't quite the same thing. We know what Karpas is now. We understand the rationale for why some of the rabbis suggested this kind of unique interpretation. But when it comes to the cloth, it's a different thing. Is it phony or is it real? Well, let me tell you a little bit about it. And I've studied this since 1980, and I have a fair amount of background. Well, first of all, there was a guy named Secundo Pia. Secundo Pia in 1898 was hired by the church to photograph the shroud. It had been on display. Periodically it is displayed. And if you were to look at it just as the shroud, it looks like a very faint image. Obviously it has an image of a man, front and back of the entire body. That's there, like a cloth that had covered the entire body. But what Secundo Pia found out when he developed the film in this early photographic process is actually the shroud is a photographic negative. And what he saw had incredible detail of the kind that we see here. That is the reverse image of the shroud. The shroud itself in its normal view is is a photographic negative. And what we learn a lot of other things that's so interesting. For example, one of the ways we know that the journey of the shroud is, as understood by history, Jerusalem, Edessa, Constantinople, Lille, and then finally a city in Rome, Turin, is that there is pollen embedded in the shroud, so that, for example, one well-known criminologist, a Swiss criminologist named Max Frey, actually, under a microscope, analyzed the pollen, the deposits of pollen. And here's what's so interesting. The pollen is very unique to geographic areas, and what he found is that the pollen was in all the places that were mentioned, including around Jerusalem. In fact, the majority of the pollen was from that area. And that was very, very compelling to him, and it has been to other researchers. Now, another thing that grabbed me when I first started looking at this was the anatomical detail, meaning the biology is so exact. It really is a person. Because the question was raised, well, maybe this thing was just concocted in the Middle Ages some clever artist just wanted to create a relic. You know, and there's a lot of relics, and maybe many of them are not real. But so what about that anatomical detail? We don't have time to get into all the details, but let me just tell you a couple things. If I were to show you the hands of the shroud, what you'd find is that there are real blood stains, and this has been absolutely determined. It's type AB blood, a fairly rare kind of blood, but nonetheless, we know about AB blood. And it has seeped in to the shroud, and the blood stains match exactly what the Gospels say about where Yeshua, the crown of big, long thorns, were jammed on top of his head. There is a blood stain at his side. We know that the scripture says in the Gospel of John that a spear was thrust into his rib cage to make sure that he was dead. And also there were blood stains at his wrists and at his feet. Well, what's so interesting about the blood stains at his wrists is this. Question: where would medieval painters of the crucifixion normally place the pictures of the pierced hands? Where would it be? It would be in the palm. Yeah, if you've seen pictures, it's very common. But the point is, crucifixion could never have worked that way. The Roman soldiers, who were professional executioners, knew that the palm, if you put nails in the palm, the hand would tear out and the person would not experience the horrors of crucifixion. But there is a spot described by physiologists as Destet's spot. It's in the wrist, and it's 4 little bones that converge at that point, and a nail that is put there would hold. Well, where do you think the blood stains are on the shroud? In the palm? No, they're in the wrists. And here's a detail that we would never expect a forger to do. The thumbs, if you were to look at the whole shroud and look at the hands, the thumbs are pulled to the center of the hand. And we know that because of the nerve damage caused by that horrible treatment, the thumbs move in, and that's exactly what's reflected on the shroud. It's not the kind of detail that a middle-aged forger would have possibly known about. So, let me tell you a little bit more about it. The image of the shroud is a completely superficial image. Now, why is that important? Because if it were a forgery, the natural way a forgery would have been done would have been with some kind of paint, some kind of compound that naturally would have seeped into the fibrils, deeper into the fibrils of the linen cloth. However, and this is amazing, the image on the shroud is completely superficial. It is only on the uppermost outer side of the uppermost fibrils of the shroud. There is no seepage. There was no dye. There was no paint. In fact, it had been an absolute mystery as to how this could have been accomplished. But whatever happened, it was not through any kind of paint or dye. It is absolutely on the superficial, on the outer fibrils. Okay? And here's another thing that was discovered in around 1978 by scientists at the Los Alamos Laboratory in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and that is that the shroud image contains 3-dimensionality. It is 3-dimensional. It's not like any painting. In fact, it's unrepeatable. No one has ever been able to repeat it. 3-dimensional image. They had this gizmo called the VP8 image analyzer used intended for use in space so that if they're on Mars with a little robot going around, they could tell the contours of the land by sensing the 3-dimensional aspect of the terrain. In the shroud's case, unlike anything else, there is nothing anywhere in the world of art or archaeology or anywhere that has this 3-dimensional quality, of which I know nothing about in terms of the technical aspects, but I have heard the scientists talk about it, okay? And by the way, these scientists some were Jewish, believers, unbelievers, atheists. There was absolutely no religious criteria for the scientists who in the late 70s looked at this thing and came up with that kind of information. Now, the question then became, all right, if it wasn't dye, if it wasn't pigment, if nothing seeped in except the blood stains, because they're real, those blood stains in the places that I told you, then what caused the image? And the latest data would suggest this: a stupendous millisecond burst of heat light. The estimated wattage was 7 billion watts of heat light energy emanating from the body of the shroud, animating the body, giving it life again. And that's amazing. You have the anatomical detail, you have the superficial image, that's the three-dimensionality. You have other things I'll talk about in a few minutes, but a problem came up in 1988, and I want to tell you what that problem was. And it really had me stumped. They carbon dated the shroud. Maybe some of you remember this. There were 3 labs, Cambridge and 2 other labs, which were chosen. A small section of the shroud was cut into 3 labs. And what did the 3 labs come up with? The shroud was a middle-aged forgery. Now, what do you do with that? On the one hand, you have this irrefutable evidence of its uniqueness, its antiquity, the places that it had been. The historical record is, you have all that stuff. You have the anatomical detail. You have all this data on one side. And on the other side, you have 3 labs saying, sorry, forgery, like all the other relics or many of the other relics. So I talked to a friend of mine, who some of you know, Dr. Robert Newman, PhD astrophysicist from Cornell University, postdoc with NASA, blah, 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 blah. And he believed, as I did, in the authenticity of the shroud. But I asked him, Doc, what do we do about this? What do you do when you have data on this side and data on this side and it completely conflicts? What do you do? And what he said was, well, you put it in the question mark box in your brain and you just wait. Does that make sense to you, everybody? Yeah. You just wait because you have conflicting data. So what do you do? So we waited and we waited until very recently, and here's what happened. You see, the cloth from the shroud actually had a backing which was put on by very skillful nuns after a 1532 fire, where some of the side of the shroud, not the image, was burned with molten silver that fell down on it. And they, the loving hands of the nuns, used the same kind of weave, and they added this material, the backing of the shroud. And it turns out that the piece of cloth was cut from that backing, and it wasn't linen, it was cotton, which was not used in the first century. And that's the explanation. I'd assume it was done accidentally. A little hard to know how such top scholars would foul something like that up quite so easily, but I'll quote to you the major scientist who, well, the guy I read, I'm sure there are others, but this is Ray Rogers from Los Alamos. He said, the radiocarbon sample was not part of the original cloth and is invalid for determining the age of the shroud. So the dye, the replacement cloth was used in the dating, and that puts everything together. Well, let me mention other 2 quick things about the shroud that you would find very interesting. Because of advanced photography and the techniques that have only gotten better and better, what they found in the eyes of the man in the shroud, 2 small Roman coins called leptons. So, you know, it's a common burial custom. If eyes pop open of a deceased person, coins are put on there to preserve the dignity of the individual. Okay, and guess what these coins were? They've identified them with 4 distinguishing markings that make them totally. We know what they are. They were leptons issued by Pontius Pilate in the year 29. Isn't that cool? Let me mention one more, and I'll close with this aspect, and then I'll tie this whole thing together for you. As the photographic techniques have gotten better, what they have discovered is that the man in the shroud had tefillin on. He wore tefillin. Do Do you know what tefillin are? We daven with them today. We have archaeological examples of tefillin from the Qumran area, the Dead Sea. We know that they were around in the first century. What I didn't know is that in Jerusalem, burying someone in tefillin was obviously a practice done by some at least. But think of it from a Messianic Jewish standpoint. We're talking about an initiating event. If this thing is legitimate, and believe me, no forger in the Middle Ages would have put tefillin on the guy that couldn't even be seen until you had an image that was clear enough and all. And so, the way Sue put it the other day was, God in His mercy for us at a time of tremendous disequilibrium in our society, at a time when we've had 2 world wars and all the other events of the modern age, Yeshua has given us a selfie. He has given us a picture of Himself. A picture of Himself to encourage us because its truthfulness could never have been determined before the modern scientific era. It is a gift to us. If it's authentic, you can buy it or not. I'm just telling you what I know about it, okay? This is ultimately, you have to decide for yourself. But I'm telling you, those leptons from the year 29, minted in 29, Him having tefillin, and you can even see it if you look at some of the videos. The box, you can see the straps on the left arm. It is amazing. And what an attestation for us of the story, the grand story that we understand as Messianic Jews. The grand story of not Yeshua the one giving a relic to the church and leaving the Jews out. Rather, it's Yeshua the Jew, buried as a Jew by His friends, reminding us of whatever things we might be incorrect in our theological outlook. I'm sure there's stuff because no one gets it all right. I want to tell you this. We're right about the guy. We are right about the big picture. And it is so magnificent from a symbolic standpoint that Yeshua would be buried with the quintessential symbol of fidelity to God's covenant between Israel and Himself, because the tefillin contain verses of the Shema, which are all about that covenant. And we wind that, when I daven and put on tefillin, and some of you do too, we're reminded of the covenant of love God has for us when He says that He would betroth us in love and goodness and faithfulness and all that good stuff. So let me close this all out this way. What we have are 2 initiating symbols, one suggested by the rabbinic mind, and that is the idea of the Karpas as representing a particular cloth which initiated what came about ultimately hundreds of years later, the Exodus that we celebrate at Passover. But we also have something so meaningful for us tonight, because tonight is the night that Yeshua rested in the grave before His resurrection after Shabbat. He was crucified on the Friday. Saturday, His Talmidim rested, and He rested. But then Sunday, a burst of heat energy emanating from within His crucified body, reminding us now, no one takes my life away from me. I take my life up again. I'm paraphrasing a passage which I'm sure many of you know. The suffering of Joseph and Yeshua, unjust, painful. Everyone knew the truth, that is, Joseph's brothers, but went along with the deception. The brothers and later Judas, Yeshua's brother, one of the 12, one of his best friends, betrayed the innocent, both true in both stories. Jacob, his world was destroyed when his sons presented him with the blood-soaked cloth of an animal. The Talmidim, in shock, disoriented, feeling tremendous guilt for all their pronouncements of loyalty, and yet they all headed for the hills when Yeshua was arrested, and they were in fear. Joseph, his coat may have initiated the story of suffering, but it ended with the Exodus, and his very bones carried back to Eretz Yisrael. Yeshua, the shroud covered his lifeless, tortured body. But when Shabbat ended, a beam of heat energy, estimated at 7 billion watts, animated his body. He rose, the stone was blasted away, and the future triumph of the Jewish people and world redemption were secured forever. That's what this is all about. And I leave you with only one question. Passover 4 questions, I leave you with one. In light of these things, are you willing to say a bit more of a yes to God during this coming year, from this Passover to the following? Are you willing to say, I am going to live for truth because this is truth, and I'm going to give myself even more deeply to the purposes of God? If you do, you won't be sorry, because you are following the truth. Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Shabbat Shalom, Rabbi Rich. Thank you. Yeah, great message. Really interesting and inspiring. Isn't that interesting stuff, huh? Well, let it inspire us this Pesach, just like Rabbi Rich said, to draw closer and draw more near and walk even more in his ways. So let's close our service today.